we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Like with the pink hair, like 10 out of 10. I can't believe she just told them, like, I don't have to like try hard. I just have to count. Like, that is complete control of your body and mind.
It's her being like, yeah, I just pretended I was dead. If you don't know, we're talking about Physical 100, which is our new household obsession.
And by household obsession, it is just us two.
Yeah, we got told off by our housemate for being way too loud, screaming at the TV. We didn't know what time it was, and they were like, it's literally past midnight.
It was a show that was made for me and for you.
Yeah.
And for us.
I want to be so strong now.
We need to start lifting some weights, man. Like, what am I doing running? What am I running away from? Who am I running away from?
Truly.
What am I running towards?
What's my goal?
What is my goal? And with that, what is the goal of today's text?
Yeah. Today on Theoryish, we are looking at the SCUM Manifesto by Valerie Solanas. Yeah, it is a text.
Ooh. Yep.
I want to say up top, like, real serious, housekeeping wise, we will be swearing in this episode, so if that's not something you like, because Solanas swears a lot, so there is a content warning there, but also a general content warning for just pure violence, bad mental health stuff, but just also content warning that is sexual abuse spoken about in this episode. Yeah, I think that's the main ones.
Yeah,
murder is also going to be mentioned.
Murder is going to be mentioned, and attempted murder is also going to be mentioned. And before you go out and read this text, please know that she's using a lot of slurs in this text, a lot of misogynistic and misandry, and a lot of trans erasure. It is a text.
Yeah, we will, in the description of this episode, be putting some, like, mental health support stuff. Not because we're saying you definitely need it if you're reading this book or anything like that, but if you're having quite serious thoughts along the lines of Solanas, it might be best to go and speak to somebody. Yeah, rather than end up in her position that she ended up in. So, yeah, with all that said, I can give a little intro to Solanas and the SCUM Manifesto. So, Valerie Solanas is, or was, an American radical feminist who lived from 1936 to 1988, who has been described many a time as a misandrist. If you don't know what misandry means, it means a person who dislikes, despises, or is strongly prejudiced against men. She had a very difficult childhood. She suffered from sexual abuse from her father and grandfather, and she had a really volatile relationship with her mother and her stepfather. There was a quote, I can't remember where I got this from, it might just be from the general wiki, so I don't know how legitimate it is. But to give a sense of who she was as a child, she wrote insults for children to use on one another for the cost of a dime. She beat up a girl in high school who was bothering a younger boy, and she also hit a nun. So that is Solanas. So in 1953, she also had a son whose father was a married sailor, and the child was taken away and she never saw him again. And this one I'm a little bit unsure of, but apparently in the 1950s she came out as a lesbian, though she later denied this when she was questioned about it. And she also has a background and a degree in psychology, so this will come in later. Solanas is most well known for attempting to murder Andy Warhol in 1968. And to summarize that whole situation, because I think it was a really key moment in Solanas' life.
It was batshit crazy.
Yeah, literally. In New York, she asked Warhol, I can't remember how she met him. I think she just met him like on the street.
Yeah, well, this is also like 60s, 70s New York. There is a reason why there's so much stuff from this time period. Everyone was just living next to each other.
Yeah. So in New York, she asked Warhol to produce her play called Up Your Ass. The premise of the play was that it was based on a plot about a woman who's a man-hating hustler and panhandler, and she ends up killing a man. The play was actually rediscovered in 1999 and reproduced in 2000, and it's actually an ebook that was published in 2014. So you can read it if you really want to.
It reminds me of Eileen Wuornos, almost.
So they say, as far as I can tell, people called it adolescent, farcical, fun, provocative. So to give you a sense of this play.
Fun?
Fun? Question mark?
Oh.
So Solanas had given Warhol the manuscript for the play, and Warhol said he lost the script. According to the consensus around what happened, Warhol's films were actually often shut down by the police for obscenity, and he thought the script was so pornographic that it was a police trap set for him. So that's potentially why he lost it.
Yeah, and before anyone says that sounds like the most insane thing possible, please remember at this time the FBI were literally feeding people drugs. And that is not a conspiracy theory, that is fact. Look it up. The police and the FBI were rogue during this time period. Yeah, this is like just before Watergate. So like there was definitely a lot of spying and a lot of shutting down of like very big art pieces, especially in this time period. There was a lot of in-person installations, and yeah, it sounds like he's being crazy, and possibly yes, but there is a basis.
So Solanas doesn't take this too well, and she starts to harass him by the phone, like via the phone, trying to find out what happened to the manuscript. She also found his home number. I have no idea how she did this, but this was quite frightening for Warhol. His relationship with Solanas like impacted his life moving forward. I also just want to say very quickly, because I forgot to say it up top, we're not in the nice podcasting studio. We are currently in one of the PhD rooms in the Sociology building, which is right next to a road. So if you can hear beepy cars, that's why, but hopefully you can't.
The students should be less, since it's reading week when we're recording.
Yeah, so it's a little bit quieter.
We're adding ambiance.
Yeah. So Warhol then proceeds to offer her a job as a typist, and she got a little bit mad about this, and she demands him money for the script. And then he pays her $25 to perform in his film, I, a Man, by way of compensation. And this film was an erotic drama in which the main character, Tom Baker, has sexual encounters with 8 women. So the film was created as a response to a popular erotic Scandinavian film called I, a Woman. Solanas was apparently really happy with her experience of working with Warhol, and she also has a non-speaking role in another of his films, Bike Boy. So, yeah. At the time, a Parisian publisher of censored works, Maurice Guiraud-Diaz, offered Solanas a contract which she then interprets as a conspiracy between him and Warhol to steal her future writings. And so, because of this perception that they're going to steal her writings, on the 3rd of June 1968, she goes to a place called The Factory and shoots Warhol, art critic Mario Amaya, and attempts to shoot Warhol's manager, Fred Hughes.
And she states that she wanted to shoot one of them in the head, and the only reason that didn't happen was because her gun jammed.
Yeah. And Warhol was actually pronounced clinically dead, and he was revived after 5 hours of surgery. So That could have very well killed him. She turned herself over to the police and is later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. She serves a 3-year prison sentence, which seems kind of low to me. But she then gets treatment in a psychiatric hospital. So after her release, she continues to promote SCUM Manifesto, which is what we're discussing today. And she continues to stalk Warhol and others over telephone, and she was arrested again in November 1971. She was institutionalized several times. She dies in 1988 of pneumonia, and her mother said she actually lived a very happy life, quote, populated with friends and gentle experiences to the end. And this quote comes from Ronald, who does the introduction for the verso version of the text. But it also appears that she was writing something else near her death, and her mother actually burned all her belongings posthumously, so we're not actually clear what she was writing, just that she was writing something.
Probably something about her mom. Speculating.
Maybe. I don't know, yeah, I don't know why she would burn it. But yeah, that's Valerie Solanas.
A character.
Interesting person, yeah.
Yeah.
So the SCUM Manifesto was published in 1967, and it's a radical feminist manifesto. And radical feminism, I've mentioned it kind of at the top of this episode, but it's a type of feminism that views society as a patriarchy in which men dominate and oppress women, versus other kinds of feminism. You know, a more general view on feminism is it's looking for equality between everybody.
And also, this is just one offshoot of radical feminism. It can go into many, many different interpretations. Yeah, so this is still second wave feminism. So this is very much based on biology. The pill had just been created in the 1960s. The FDA allowed for the pill to be used in the 1960s. I'm going off the top of my head. So, you know, it's for the first time women were also able to control whether or not they wanted to be mothers. And we're talking about women in a very binary dialogue. So we're talking about sex. We're not talking about gender. Gender is a spectrum. We can go into that much later because this text is very... How do I say it? This text is it doesn't believe the concept of gender. It only believes in the concept of sex.
Yeah. And, you know, sex can be a spectrum as well.
So these ideas are not formally introduced to the Academy. But no. Valerie Solanas, even if it had been published, she would have ignored it.
It's true, yeah. So, SCUM, the SCUM in SCUM Manifesto, the word SCUM actually means a layer of dirt or froth on the surface of a liquid. But people believe that the term scum means society for cutting up men. This isn't actually stated in the book or the manifesto. And so some actually argue that it doesn't mean this, and it means more, you know, we'll talk about it later, but she starts to introduce this idea of scum women, of women being ostracized because they are scum. So a particular type of woman rather than society for cutting up men.
Yeah, which I think she both would love. that is what people believe to be the acronym. But also it still puts men on the forefront, and that's what she would absolutely detest.
So the manifesto argues that men have ruined the world and that it's really up to the women to fix it. It gets much darker than that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but it's actually a bit up in the air as to whether this work is more satirical. There are sources that claim that Solanas stated it was satirical and it was designed to be provocative rather than an actual plan. And others have stated that Solanas has declared the work as dead serious. The kind of way I see people using it now is more in this kind of provocative parody and satire type of way. And that would actually go in line, you know, we were talking earlier about that play that she wrote, Up Your Ass, which is more parody. So it fits in line with the type of work she would do, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I think, you know, during this time period, provocative works were in vogue. And she's an excellent writer, if anything. We have to say this is wonderfully written. It is a weird, peculiar humor, because there is humor, like, in it. But that humor is at the expense of people's lives.
Yeah.
So I think this text exists in a way where she's like, I'm kidding, haha, but really. And I think this is very purposefully written. It's very consciously written. The language that she uses and how she describes things are obviously quite manic, but the thesis is there. And she means it. Yeah. And like, she self-published this a year before.
So
Warhol.
She starts self-publishing copies in 1967. She charges women $1 and men $2 to buy it. So she's just like handing them out on the street, as far as I'm aware. And then she signs a publishing contract with Maurice, as mentioned earlier, and the publishing contract is for a novel, but she asks him to accept SCUM Manifesto in its place. The first commercial edition was published by Olympia Press in New York in 1968. Solanas actually complains about this copy as changes were made, quote, for the worse. And she wanted other changes to be made and they weren't included. And in 1977, she self-publishes a correct version. We are reading the edition published by Verso in 2004, so I'm not sure, I couldn't really tell whether this was based on the Olympia Press version or Solanas' self-published copies. I would assume Olympia, as that's more widely known, but again, I'm not sure. And there were mistakes, like grammatical errors. I don't know if you spotted this. There's a load of like open brackets that never close.
Yep.
So I don't know.
I think it was her on a typewriter.
Yeah, but her point was that Olympia Press actually edited it and made it like messed up in terms of grammar and stuff like that. So I don't know which version we're reading.
Yeah, and also she was a mad woman.
Mm-hmm. And the last kind of thing I want to say is that this piece is also seen as like almost like utopian. It's really interesting. And like Paula was saying before we started recording, it's like very anarchist, very utopian. So we'll kind of go into it with those thoughts. But I wanted to see, Paula, I've been talking for a while. What are your kind of first thoughts on the text?
We can cuss in this one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Holy shit. A good PhD friend of mine was very excited for me to read this, and I was like, I don't know what that means, and now I've read it and I'm like, I need to talk to her. Because this was a wild ride. I'm not gonna lie, I thought some parts were really funny in a very dark way, where I do not agree with this woman at all, but she's kind of funny. But when you get to the end, one, she gets like quite repetitive. Like the points that she made earlier, there's no depth. And then at the end, you're just like, you're encouraging mass murder. And like kind of ends with that. And I for once, I have no words. Because it is absolute batshit. It is insanity. And the point is to elicit a reaction. She got my reaction.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say, like, it's not just mass murder, but it's almost like mass suicide. Although this is up for debate as to whether she wanted men to die. Because there is a whole conversation about... She talks throughout the manifesto about how all men want is violence. And so why would she give them that violence? And there is a bit that she brings in, but I'm not sure.
She wants cleansing. Like, I am sorry to say, like, because she says, I'm not going to enact violence, but then she is totally enacting violence. And then we'll get to this later on in the text, but she's promoting a society where, like, you don't have to procreate anymore, because you would have eternal life except for men. So she just wants men to die out and women to live forever, but not in a way where you're constantly reproducing only women. There's no reproduction, just women, and you live forever for all eternity. And bad shit.
Yeah. So I can see why people think this is satire. Like you said, it's entertaining, but to me, it reads like a person chucking their thoughts at a page. And maybe not necessarily just chucking their thoughts, chucking their rage into writing and seeing what sticks. And I'll probably say this throughout, but it's very self-centered. It weirdly removes agency from both men and women, so that only Solanas has answers.
Only Valerie knows. I'm calling her Valerie.
So the introduction is written by Ethel Ronald, at least for the verso version. Ronald is an American academic who looks at philosophy, literary studies, psychoanalysis, political philosophy, and ethics. She seems to be a contentious figure herself. I won't go into this too much. If you want to Google it, that's in your power, that's not in mine. There's a whole sexual harassment case which resulted in her being suspended without pay in 2018, 2019. But if I'm referring to Ronald, that's who I'm referring to, because it's the whole introduction.
Yeah, you read the introduction. I did not have time.
It adds interesting context. I won't say I agree with all of it.
Yeah, I think, what was the point you made about Ronald believing that this text was like kind of in the avant-garde to like Riot Girl? And
so I'm gonna give two quotes, one
Of
that
course.
kind of references that and one that kind of references how Ronald pictures Solanas, and I think it's interesting. So quote, and this is on page 7 and 8, quote, "What I mean by she runs with the best of them is that Solanas, a part of whose pain grows out of a disturbed relationship to higher education, matches print with those who situate the father as primal enemy, Freud et al., paternity is fiction, Derrida et al., gender is part of the performative effort, Butler et al., capital flow is a traumatic historical outbreak, Goethe, Marx, and Deleuze et al., and so on and so forth." So what Ronald's kind of saying here is that Solanas is almost, she's clearly reading a lot of these people and it's influencing her work. So much so that Solanas is almost like a precursor for some of these ideas. She almost like came up with these ideas too soon. That's Ronald's point of view. And then she's got a bit about, I can't remember exactly where it is, but she basically says that Ronald believes that Solanas almost like comes before a time period that might accept her and it might accept some of these ideas. Not all, but if you think about, there's a lot of radical feminism that comes after, maybe not quite so as radical as this, but you also get a kind of lesbian feminism that relies on something called political lesbianism, which is women who reject men in their entirety, even if they're not necessarily attracted to women. So it's a type of calling yourself a lesbian for political interests. So there are some, and if you think about a lot of the gay liberation movements engaged in anti-capitalist notions, which Solanas is definitely sitting in, maybe?
yeah, this is where when you texted me this and I was like, no. Because Valerie was just too into herself to play well with others. So like we were talking about, like Riot Girl music would be like the closest thing, but it's still, a lot of the women in these movements ended up married to men. Valerie would not agree. No, Valerie is in her own little camp. Like nothing will ever satisfy her. And that is written throughout the text. Nothing will make her happy. Because even when she talks about the things that would create this utopic society, it's still not positive.
It's interesting to think of why we want to look at this now. You know, why does it then get published? If it's so horrendous, then why does it get published by Verso? You know, you can buy, by the way, if you want to buy it, you can buy it for under £10 on Verso, I believe.
The sleeve says £10. Yeah.
I had a look, it was like £9 something.
Oh, wow.
Maybe it's gone under.
Ooh, interesting.
I believe it's around £10 I think you can buy it for. Or, there's a free version which we will link in the description, but that is the Olympia Press version, just so that you're aware. So why do we want to look at this kind of now? I personally think in our time period, there's a popular rhetoric of kind of fuck men, or especially fuck poor men. And I feel like Solanas almost takes this idea to its extreme. And I mean fuck as in like, we don't like them.
Yeah, like, I don't want no scrub.
Yeah. And I think it can be productive to think about what happens when we take these ideas to their extreme, to understand actually how unproductive this kind of thought can be for gender equality, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I saw this as like with the rising popularity of the TERF movement, specifically here in the UK, these narratives are being rebranded and reused. Like the TERF movement is a movement against men, and it's against trans people. It's against everyone except a very small population of women that base their entire structure on like eugenicist narratives of what gender and sex and performity are. So I think things like the SCUM Manifesto, while they at this moment in time do not see themselves as hating men, they use that fear and then they can include these arguments into their movement. Yeah.
And also, you made an interesting point that I made a note of earlier. It's this hatred of men and this insecurity of what femininity is, which is what Solanas definitely has. Just to bring in a quote here from the text starts off by saying that the male is a biological accident. The Y male gene is an incomplete X female gene. That is, it has an incomplete set of chromosomes.
That is kind of a bar. This is where I mean, like, it is completely horrendous what she's saying, but the way she just spits it out, we can argue about parody sincerity. There is sincerity in that. The male as a biological accident are very choice words.
And this is within the first page, right?
This is the first page.
Yeah, and she basically, the point that she's trying to make throughout, like one of the overarching theses of the manifesto, is that men are trying to make up for that lack of femininity in themselves. And, this plays out in very misandrist ways. This also plays out in very homophobic ways.
Yeah, she's also writing in antithesis, as you mentioned earlier with the Ronald introduction. She's also working in antithesis to psychoanalysis and particularly Freud. Throughout the text, she's calling it pussy envy instead of penis envy. And she's sort of reworking that Oedipal structure towards a misandrist endpoint. And that, in a way, is revolutionary. It is still evil.
Yeah. And so, connecting it back to today, a lot of the TERF movement relies upon this fear of men entering female spaces and men trying to take over femininity or trying to take femininity from women. Obviously, it's all bullshit, but
Yeah, and this sort of fear just creates spaces of not just discomfort, but other forms of violence. Because these TERFs see themselves, and TERFs I'm using to include both men and women, because there's lots of men, especially in this country, lots of men are TERFs. But they only see trans women as the threat. They don't see trans men as a threat, which I always find very interesting.
As far as I see, what TERFs say about trans men is that women had no choice other than to become men. And that's kind of their argument, which is why they kind of treat them almost like childlike, like, oh, you didn't know what you were doing. Which
is, I think, the biggest issue that we also see reflected in this text. It's the treatment of women as if they're fragile and weak, and then that they need protection. And it turns around to being quite, like, misogynist. But we're heading off the point, which is the current crisis of masculinity. And I think this is also a response to these, like, we hate men narratives that we see a lot. It is very stressful because there are points. There are certain aspects of our society in which cis men are stepping into a platform where they're dictating cis women's bodies and trans women's, everyone's bodies except their own. And with the rise since the 60s, since the introduction of the pill, as we mentioned earlier, women have been having a more active role in the financial sphere. And now we can say that women are becoming way more educated than men. Once more, we're working with the sex spectrum here, not gender spectrum, for the sake of this argument. But women are becoming more, have been more financially independent, more educationally independent, and women are starting to reject traditional familial roles. Not to say that that is good or bad, that is the choice of the individual, but a lot of this is rooted in capitalism. Like, we can't afford to have houses, we can't afford to have children because we have student loan debt. But it can be misinterpreted as, oh, women don't need men anymore, so they're just rejecting men for that reason, which turns men into, dare we say, the Andrew Tates of the world, in which they think to be in a relationship, they have to put the position of woman as a position of subservience.
And so there's also an interesting argument that's taking place. I want to say it's kind of new. I'm only just starting to see this discussion, whereby men are moving more to these right-wing circles because there seems to be like easy answers of what it takes to be a man, right? You exercise a lot, you know, like, oh, do you know there's like dating, do you remember, like that used to be a thing.
Yes,
there's like dating, how to date women,
Hitch.
yeah, like that. Like, there seems to be easier answers on what it means to be a man and what you need to get women, right? Versus, you know, in more lefty circles where there's a more of an abstract encouragement to deal with feelings and deal with emotions and treat women as equal.
Well, it's not just that, it's looking at yourself and acknowledging the things that you have done or the things that are around you and questioning the male and female figures in your life. And that is really hard. Like, I feel for men because they're raised to have a certain voice and act a certain way in our society, especially if they are born into a nuclear family structure here in the West. Also, let's put the elephant in the room. This is all Western perspective. So, like, when men grow up and they're, you know, wanting to do that work, it takes a lot of unlearning. And it is far easier to be told, yeah, just work out, invest in crypto, you know?
Yeah. Especially if you're a poor man, right? If you come from a certain class background and you're also dealing with the inequalities of like, oh, I don't have enough money to afford to eat. It's more, you're not fulfilling that kind of role of breadwinner in your family. You know, a lot of these Andrew Tate types, they try to emphasize, you know, this isn't just how to be a man, this isn't just how to get women, this is how to become rich, how to become a baller, like how to become the best.
How to have power.
Yeah,
because like, for example, with Andrew Tate, he came from a very poor family background. His dad was a really famous chess player, but like he didn't make that much money. His parents separated. His mom moved him back here to the UK where they were very, very poor. And he did a lot of horrible things to attain his money, and that's why he's currently in a Romanian prison. Circling back to this text, the point is not based in reality. It's based on idealism and like utopic visions of the self. These are both two very selfish people at different points of the spectrum. Andrew Tate is men first, women last, and Valerie Solanas is women first, men last. And if anyone disagrees and thinks that I'm being far too harsh with Valerie Solanas, I'm sorry. She is a violent person and her writings are violent.
Yeah, the violence comes through in the text. We'll kind of get to it a bit later, but it's funny in some ways because, you know, we're both women. We both grew up in certain environments. You know, we've experienced sexism and other things, right? And so in some parts of it, you do go, oh, you know, it's funny. It's like people on TikTok making jokes about men, right? It's the same kind of vibe. Except Solanas, like I said, takes it to the extreme and is like, oh, but what if they died though?
Yeah, it's like the crazy ex-girlfriend song, let's generalize about men. Yeah. But also, I think to go back to the main argument, it's always these small texts that make us go into 20 different routes. But you brought up the most amazing point of this all, which is biological essentialism. This is second wave feminism, is very focused on the sexes, not gender, the sexes. It's looking at women for the first time actually like pursuing degrees in education, entering the workforce, and realizing that they're treated like fucking shit in the workforce.
And biological essentialism, for those who aren't aware, is basically a fancy way of saying that you treat a person as if they are their biology. And, you know, this works both against people and, in some people's minds, to their advantage, right? So if you think about achieving rights for maternity leave, right, that was based on this idea of a maternal relationship with mother and child, and there was a call for that to be paid time, right? Yeah.
And not just that, paternal leave as well, because going another layer, it's focusing only on the person that gave birth, and it's not focusing on the man or the other partner, let's say, wanting to have time with their child as well.
Paternal leave, I can't remember how long it is. It's only a few weeks, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Versus, like, I think you can take a year. You can tell I don't have children.
Yeah, and it's also, I have seen people take it at different times so that they can take care of the child. So either the maternal figure takes that time, and then once their time runs out, the paternal figure takes that time. So they're not even doing this together to make sure that they're financially stable.
So you have those kinds of biological essentialism almost like tied to rights. And then you have biological essentialism that relies on a like theory of eugenics, right? Like, you know, it's been used in horrendous ways in the past. But if you think of the transphobia right now, you think of how trans women are seen as men in disguise versus women.
Yeah, it's assigning the sexual capacity of a person to their gender. And it's my biggest argument with TERFs is that, like, a woman gives birth, a woman bleeds, and it's just like, it's very eugenicist because some women are just not born with that anatomy. I'm talking about cis women. They're just not born with that anatomy, or they rely on certain gender roles within society for women to enact. And like, when women don't do that, does that mean they're any less of a woman? These are very weak stances.
I don't know if people are seeing this. This is starting to come up on my TikTok in very scary ways. But it's women, cis women, saying, oh, well, you will want a child someday. Don't say you hate children, or don't say you don't want children, because you will want it. Almost like it's a given. Like, you will have children, you will do these things, like your biology is forcing you to do this. And it's reducing people to their bodily parts rather than treating people as whole people.
Well, it's treating people like cattle. And it's also, this argument can also go deeper into racism, which, especially right now in the States, I don't know that much about the statistics here in the UK, but in the States, for the first time, I think there's a higher concentration of people of color having larger families and reproducing, and the white population is actually dwindling for the first time ever. So there's also that insecurity of being taken over, quote unquote. I did air quotes with my hands. These arguments are very deep and they can go many different routes, is what we're trying to say.
Yeah.
And a lot of these arguments and insecurities that we are dealing with right now are based on second wave feminism's propulsion for sex differentiation, which is both good and bad. Like, it was needed.
You saw it because it wasn't just in feminism, you also saw it in gay rights movements that were proclaiming rights on the basis that this was a biological thing. I was born this way, therefore I didn't have a choice, therefore I must have X rights. And so if you're starting your argument with an emphasis on biology, I feel like this is always where this is going to end up. You know, it's not just taking man-hating to its furthest extent, it's taking a biological essentialist notion to its fullest extent. Yeah,
and to sort of end all of this, and this need for biology within gay rights movements is all based off of like Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexualwissenschaft, so like the Institute of Sexual Sciences. And the reason that he was basing this off of biology was because there was an insecurity with his institute trying to center gay liberation with lawmaking, because laws change and can so easily be manipulated, as he saw later on with the rise of the Third Reich. He says, like, what is something that you're just born into? Biology. But during these time periods, they were just trying to not be arrested for engaging in same-sex behavior. They were not thinking about gender binary.
They were not taking it further than that point. You know?
Yeah.
And I also kind of just want to end this point, because maybe you read this a while ago and you're like, what are they on about? Like, why are they so stressed about biology? But the text kind of ends with claiming that we should control the creation of babies and to prevent deficiencies. I've got the quote, I think, in my notes. Page 68 to 69. Quote, when genetic control is possible, and soon it will be, it goes without saying that we would produce only whole, complete beings, not physical defects of deficiencies, including emotional deficiencies such as maleness. So Solanas, when she's talking about deficiencies, she's referring to men, we assume from the text. But when you think about this, like, deficiencies according to whom? It's very ableist. It's very, it's bad.
Well, it even goes beyond that. Same page. Mind you, this is the same page. Why produce even females? Why should there be future generations? What is their purpose? When aging and death are eliminated, why continue to reproduce? Even if they are not eliminated, why reproduce? Why should we care what happens when we are dead? Why should we care that there's no younger generation to succeed us? End quote. She just wants mass extinction.
And this follows from something she says earlier, where she says, I can't remember the quote, but it's basically like, men are preventing the sciences that mean we would live forever. I don't know where she's getting that from, but she basically says that if it was a woman-only society, we would have the science that say we would live forever. And if we live forever, there's no point in reproduction. And so, what?
So to me, like, the purpose of this manifesto was to reach out to the audience that was already going to be accepting of this. So I was listening to this podcast on the SCUM Manifesto. The podcast is called Book Club from Hell. It is two men, I know, shocking, reading this, and I really liked their take because, one, they were able to laugh through all of this. Like, I agree with a lot of their takes. Some of this stuff is really funny, just the way it's written, but they made really valid points, and, you know, they were quite self-deprecating in certain parts. They reached that point, which is the same question that you brought up, which is, what's the purpose of this manifesto? And I agreed partly with them. So they said this was a manifesto aimed for the people that were willing to join in her vision of this utopia. I agree with that, but they kind of ended it there. I think the point of this manifesto was, one, attention. She works in the arts, and let me tell you, as someone that also works in the arts, we love attention. So I think there is not just one purpose for this. I think she was reaching out. She wanted to have more radical viewpoints, and I think she truly despised men And she wanted to sort of work people up to agree with her and maybe even try to enact this vision of utopia. And if you think I'm crazy for thinking she actually wanted this, this is the 60s. There's a lot of like communes, there's a lot of like groups and movements acting up at this time period where she could have gotten a bunch of women together and started a cult. Like, it is 100% possible. So I think she just wanted to start her own movement.
Do you know what's interesting, kind of in line with that? So Ronald actually says that Valerie Solanas wanted to be a writer, wanted to write and wanted to be heard, and was getting more and more frustrated with not being heard. And then she meets Warhol, who, you know, almost like, in her mind, he threw away her manuscript because he didn't appreciate her words and her as a person. And then he's like, why don't you be a typist in my place? And she's like, no, nobody's appreciating my words for me. Okay.
Where were we?
I forgot what I was saying because a sun came past. Not a literal sun. Like, somebody dressed up as a sun came past the window, and then I needed to pee. Unrelated to each other.
Are we recording?
Yeah.
And I was reading a Rolling Stone listicle.
Yeah, but basically Solanas just wanted to be heard. I think that's my point.
I think. So why do we find female fury so enticing? I think as a consumer of media in which female fury is like the crux of it, I think there's something hypothetically really fun in just being unhinged. Like, society has taught women and people that are marginalized to be the excellence of their type of person. So like, and I think an antithesis to white male mediocrity, like everyone else has to be the best they can be. So this includes radical white women. They have to be the best woman they can. Queer people have to be the best queer person they can to be palatable to the powers that be. And with female rage, there is something just so scary about it because you're so forced to sit still and nod and, you know, perform this excellence, which Valerie likes to call daddy's little girl thing. And when you see someone just not doing it, it is frightening, it is monstrous and grotesque, and I think it's personally beautiful. You know, we were talking, you could not sit through the movie, but I was talking about the 1999 film Audition, and just like, you know, I'm gonna spoil a freaking, 30-year-old movie almost. She starts cutting off this man's feet. She puts needles through the sockets of his eyes, and she's just doing it in the most calm, cool, collected. Like, it is not a rage where she's screaming and enacting, she's not acting like a man. She is very like calm, cool, and collected, and that is frightening. I made you watch a little tiny bit of it, and you were like squealing in your chair. But like, there is something attractive about that. I think to women, and I think also to marginalized people. We saw Megan a couple weeks ago, and like, you know, queer people love Megan. There's an SNL sketch about Megan, and it's because there's something just fascinating about like a female figure. It doesn't have to be real, but just seeing it just unhinged that we're just attracted to.
Like, I don't consume as much like scary media as you, but one thing I do like, it's almost like getting to hear women's inside voices, right? So like, for example, SZA's new album SOS, I saw criticized quite a few times simply because it's too sad, it's too men focused, a lot of people said there was no growth. They didn't hear any growth. She didn't like come to some radical conclusion about herself, about how much better she is without this person. She's grieving a loss throughout that whole album. It's all about a breakup, right? Every stage of feeling in that breakup, that nasty, horrible rage of Kill Bill literally saying, I want to kill my ex. and I want to kill his new girlfriend as well. I really appreciated that album because even though I'm not at that point in my life now, like I have been in those like just feeling insane, right? Because you're so upset and people just look at you like, why can't you get over it? Like, why are you not having this like magic epiphany about yourself? No, sometimes I don't want an epiphany. Sometimes I want to stay in the rage and I want to stay in the upset. And I've been talking to Paula a lot about it, but Ethel Cain's album, Preacher's Daughter, it's a concept album, so it's about a made-up person. But the Preacher's Daughter goes through this whole story of being with bad men, right? And then she ends up being a prostitute and she ends up being kidnapped and murdered and cannibalized, right? Which is a really shitty story for a person to go through. But I really like that album because you get to hear the inside voice of this preacher's daughter, that how she feels throughout all of this, the subtle ways in which she still contains like ownership over her own life. And yeah, I think that's the kind of thing that I like, that kind of rage.
Yeah, I was also thinking of Melodrama by Lorde, which is a more subtle female rage, but like I think of Green, like when she's talking about like she thinks you left the beach, you're such a damn liar. Like it's just like
So we're obviously not going to end on a fan fiction because that would be entirely inappropriate. But in another inappropriate move, me and Paula, we have a playlist called SCUM Manifesto, which is full of toxic women singing.
Not toxic women.
Oh,
toxic standpoints.
Songs. Yeah.
I think you can see who added what. And yours are just like, you know, SZA and like women just being angry, and mine are like, no, these women want to kill me.
Yeah,
and that's as we're did we even talk about the SCUM Manifesto? Yeah, because like it sounds like we haven't really directly done quotes. It's because this manifesto is all over the place. So the things that she says are, one, at points quite dated. She talks about hippies.
Groovy.
The use of groovy is really funny. Like, so there's like particular points that she makes about her blanket statement on men. Let us know that this is a Western American white middle class man. A part of the text where I actually did laugh out loud, it is in the isolation, suburbs, and prevention of community. So she's talking about how these like supposedly groovy men change and then use this change to suppress women. So this is on pages 48 and 49 in the verso text. Quote, "So, like a scared rabbit, he scurries off, dragging daddy's little asshole along with him to the wilderness. The suburbs, or in this case of the hippie, he is way out, man. All the way out to the cow pasture, where he can fuck and breed and distribute and mess around with his beads and flute," end quote. His beads and flute. She separates out, "He's way out, man," with an exclamation point, which is very funny, but it is dark.
Yeah. And I will say, like, we kind of use this text. You know, we're not going to sit here and be like, I agree with this point and I disagree. It's boring. No. It's not useful.
So we talked mostly about heterosexual men within this text. She is straight up homophobic. A lot of the points that she makes on gay men use slurs that I don't feel comfortable using. But here's a quote from page 50 on conformity. Quote, "If other men are A and he's not, he must not be a man. He must be a F slur. To be sure he's a man, the male must see to it that if the female be clearly a woman, the opposite of a man, that is, the female must act like a F slur," end quote. So she's talking about while homosexual men are more tolerable, they're not okay in her book regardless, because they're just men that realize that they are not worthy of women, is basically her entire argument. And when she talks about trans women, I believe this is what the term she's trying to find, she calls them drag queens. And I think that's also on purpose, because she doesn't believe that trans men exist. But yeah, so after like page 50, it just becomes really redundant up until the very, very last points. So obviously she has a section on great art and culture, which I think is just a hit piece on Andy Warhol.
I wrote that in my notes. I was like, the discussion of the male artist sounds like Warhol, to be honest.
Yeah, it's points that have been made before. That's why we're sort of brushing over this.
Yeah, it's not as interesting.
There is certain quotes on page 60 on sexuality. She starts off with, sex is the refuge of the mindless, end quote. She can write. 1, 2, she's going into sort of asexuality, and although she, at this point, I believe you said earlier, she calls herself a lesbian. We don't know what she is, but she talks about like love, not in the way that it's sexual, but in the way that is friendship and like bonds between women, because men are not full humans in her eyes, so they cannot feel friendship or love. But like she completely just ignores same-sex female relationships.
Yeah, she does also, I think, mention asexuality as a word, which I don't think that would be a popular word. So I wonder if she had asexual feelings herself. Although, you know, I don't know for sure. But the point I wanted to actually make was Ronald brings up this kind of interesting idea about Solanas almost being like ahead of her time, not necessarily in the good way. But the whole stuff about sex actually reminds me of the feminist sex wars, which are also known as kind of like lesbian sex wars. But this was arguments that took place in the late 70s, early 80s that were sex-positive feminists on one side and anti-porn feminists on the other. And so you almost get this space that Solanas occupies of being like, I don't think anybody should be having sex. And if men didn't exist, women wouldn't want to have sex. Which is an interesting argument. Yeah.
Yeah, this is also like a very obviously traumatized woman that needs to work out her relationship with sex. And she's working it out here through murder. Because later on in the page, this is going to be a very, very long quote, but it summarizes and introduces SCUM. It is on page 61, and it is, quote, "On the other hand, those females least embedded in the male culture, the least nice, those crass and simple souls who reduce fucking to fucking, who are too childish for the grown-up world of suburbs, mortgages, mops, and baby shit, too selfish to raise kids and husbands, too uncivilized to give a shit for anyone's opinions of them, too arrogant to respect daddy, the greats, or the deep wisdom of the ancients who trust only their own animal gutter instincts, who equate culture with chicks, whose sole diversion is prowling for emotional thrills and excitement, who are given to disgusting, nasty, upsetting scenes, hateful, violent bitches, given to slamming those who unduly irritate them in the teeth, who'd sink a shiv into a man's chest or ram an ice pick up their asshole as soon as they look at him, if they knew they could get away with it. In short, those who by the standards of our culture are scum. Those females are cool and relatively cerebral, skirting asexuality," end quote. That is a lot. That is the thesis statement of this work. So for the most part, she's talking horrible about men, and most of the argument is only on men and on women that facilitate men. And here is where she finally introduces the true woman. The true woman is scum. It's the woman that doesn't want to be in these societal roles, that wants to disrupt the status quo. And this is also where I think if you had taken out everything else about men or the shanking part, because she wants to stab a man in the chest or ram an ice pick up his ass, you know, like that can also be seen in like the 90s girl punk movement. Where, you know, on the playlist I have the song by 7 Year Bitch called Dead Men Don't Rape. You know, it's that rage. And I was reading this, I was like, oh, this is super disturbing. And at the same time, I was like, this is kind of punk rock. But at the end of the day, it's still, like, frightening.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about it because it almost just sounds like she just wants to find people like her.
Yeah.
Like, she's not had those people around her. I think Ronald says at some point, she just never had somebody to almost, like, put the brakes on and be like, whoa. She's so filled with rage and upset, and it must just be exhausting to do that all by yourself.
Yeah.
It's not like now where you have the internet and you can have the internet shout your thoughts back to you.
I think she would have done worse with the internet, honestly. Because I think the last quote I have on my list, it's just one, it shows how she reduces women to body parts, her violence towards men, and also just genius writing. This was in brackets. This was not even part of the major text. She writes, quote, on page 73, males, like the rats following the Pied Piper, will be lured by pussy to their doom, will be overcome and submerged by, and will eventually drown in the passive flesh that they are, end quote. Jesus Christ. For the most part, we used the quotes that were less severe, but I think throughout the text she is growing in aggression, and the women went from daddy's little girl to just pussy, to just bits of flesh. And to some degree, she gives more respect to the men that she does the women that she's writing about. And
she gives them more agency.
She gives them way more. She does not give any woman agency throughout this entire text. She gives men, or what she perceives to be male.
But this is what I meant by it's self-centered. It's like, I am the only person who understands, and all these other people around me don't understand that. I need to make them understand.
Yeah, so I guess to conclude at this point, because we've beat this thing to death at this point, which I don't know if she would agree to it or not. I think she's gonna be in the back of our minds for a long time. This is a really good example of a piece of text that would be covered in theory, and obviously the show is called Theoryish. This is one of those times where we're going to be given an uncomfortable text that we do not agree with, that we do not want to see replicated in real time. A vision of utopia that is dangerous and violent and vile towards everyone. But the importantness of discussing this is because we were able to see how these sort of thoughts morph and integrate into our society. So yeah, this was published in 1967, massively published in 1969, but it's still being sold. This is a physical copy that I have with me.
I borrowed a copy from the library and there were like 6 copies in there. I was so surprised. I expected there to be like one little copy, and they were all on 3-day loan, which means they're being taken out quite often.
Yeah. So there is obviously a demand for this, and, you know, who knows how it's being discussed in classrooms. I'm pretty sure this is probably like a really big gender studies text. It is fascinating. Like, this does not deter from the fascination that is the text, but read at your own caution.
I think that's everything. I hope you enjoyed this one. Yeah, next time will be less stressful, hopefully.
Less stressful, less reflective of our current state of mind. Although you're a sociologist, so it always comes back to the present.
Anyway, yeah, thanks for listening.
Bye!
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.